Of course, Zoom thinks I'm DIMS today, because why not? I'm a man of many hats, what can I say?
That's
Dims don't have a
fantastic.
beard like that.
You give up being SIG Beard to be DIMS.
Brian, thank you for the nice hat. Yes, if you want to be a mentor at the next mentoring session at the next KubeCon or whatever, that's how I got this hat. It was pretty nice swag. The room known as Google, can we hear you? No.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, we were muted on the microphone.
Okay.
So we have two main topics on the agenda today. One is about KEPs and how we're going to use them and requirements for features going into Kubernetes, which we're going to do first. And originally it was, I forget how many minutes were specified, but I figured it was going to be a longer discussion and it was important. So I added more time in case we need it. And the other is the scope topic, which Matt brought, and I did some research on that. So we'll have a good discussion there. Leave a few minutes for discussion of agenda for the next meeting at the end. There were two topics from SIG Storage that were put on here initially. One is already resolved, and the other one I asked them to follow up via email, so please do take a look at the email and help them out. And if it doesn't get resolved by email, then it can get scheduled for a future meeting.
Okay, yeah. Let's talk about KEPs. I want to throw out my straw man, and then my intent is to try and listen as much as possible. So the straw man is where I say words out loud and people nod their heads, but we all acknowledge that the devil is in the details. Straw man is everything that lands in 114 must have a KEP. If it's an enhancement, it's got to have a KEP. So I forget what the line for enhancements is, but the one that I use in my brain is like, if it's something you want to brag about in the release notes, if it's something you would write a blog post about, it's a KEP. Other people, I think, have talked about how if it crosses multiple SIGs, it's a KEP. What I'm looking for is a document that starts to more formally specify everything about this bit of code, this chunk of code, whatever that's landing, because I would like to see, at a minimum, a checklist that specifies the criteria for alpha, beta, and stable. And within that checklist, I would like to see a test plan and an upgrade downgrade plan if that KEP so requires it. I feel like it is unfair to the release team to expect the release team to have sufficient technical knowledge to be able to vet all of these things. So I believe that it is the responsibility or the authority of SIG Architecture as the SIG with the most cross-cutting views across the project to ensure that we have some level of consistency in vetting these criteria. So that's basically it. Like, I think SIG Architecture needs to be a stakeholder of some form. The existing roles that we have on KEPs are reviewers or approvers or authors or maybe even editor. So I don't know if I'm asking for a new role or if I'm asking for SIG Architecture to be one of the existing roles. I also recognize that realistically within the release cycle that I've proposed, enhancements freeze is the end of January. And I want to talk about the realism of the pool of people we have available to review the amount of things we have to review. If I go purely off of the number of enhancement issues that are currently in the V113 milestone and the V114 milestone, understanding that some of these may represent issues that should actually be closed but haven't been yet, and that there are some issues yet to come, there are ballpark 37 different things to be reviewed. It seems maybe unrealistic to expect a fully detailed test plan and upgrade-downgrade plan and assessment of scope by the end of January. Maybe not. So I'm okay with this being kind of an iterative process if the community has a clear understanding that we're going to use this as a lens to kick enhancements out as we figure out the criteria. But I do really think it's time for us to talk about the process, the implementation of how we want to use CAPS, and those are my asks.
So Matt and Tim Sinclair had their hands up, by the way.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to go into ask your opinion on a point of clarity here. You talk about upgrade and downgrade tests as necessary. When you think of as necessary, what do you mean there?
I think I'm going to defer to the expertise of this SIG, but I'll just say, for example, one little headache we nearly had with CSI going to GA was that as it was originally implemented, if you took a node from the older version of CSI to the newer version of CSI, the new drivers didn't work with the old drivers or something along those lines. That's something that talked about the upgrade path really should have taken into consideration. And if I'm wearing my operator hat now, I really would be paranoid if I didn't have a stated downgrade plan. I don't know if I'm really looking for a thorough test, but I need at least some proof that we've put some thought into this, because I think that a good experience from an upgrade and downgrade perspective should be part of our criteria for beta versus stable. We have some expectations of what's allowed to happen there. I see other hands. I really can't be the moderator in this discussion.
I'm totally cool with the idea of having the sections to add there, so long as we have the clause, especially for downgrade, to say this is not backwards compatible, and that being an okay type of thing, because some things are net new features that will be, they're not, if you were to try to go backwards, they could be breaking, right?
Yeah, should we get a volunteer to keep track of the hands from someone? Anyone?
Jace, could you maybe volunteer, because you're in the room where I see multiple hands being raised?
I can, but then the mute thing gets weird. So I guess we'll just leave mute off.
Yeah, we can leave mute off.
All right. Yeah. So Tim's got his. So I think Brian was next. I didn't see who was after that except for Jago. So.
Sorry, just one point. I would suggest that actually that room, we all just use the raise hand thing in Zoom. So you in the big room, you decide among yourselves which of you is going to go first.
Okay.
Okay. So a couple of things. One is we do have existing criteria which we could change or refine about what constitutes an enhancement, and I think using those same criteria for KEPs makes sense. Following up on what Tim said, I think anything we want to be criteria, we should add to the template. I think that would be good. We have been talking about raising the quality bar, and KEPs are definitely one of the tools we should use to do that. So as we come up with testing criteria, we should put a link to those criteria into the existing KEP template. The graduation criteria section, the existing section in the template, is found to be confusing because it is actually just talking about how do we evaluate whether the feature works the way users expect, which isn't the normal meaning we have for graduation criteria. So we should fix that. I think there, in terms of upgrade and downgrade and some other things, there's some additional criteria that we're going to be considering as well, and we should figure out how to roll those in this year. For example, we're talking about ensuring monitoring right there. Yeah, Jago added that. I was going to mention that as well. That we add monitoring for features that we need to be able to, operators need to be actually able to operate the clusters and understand what's going on. So we have somewhat inconsistent support for exporting information about Kubernetes behavior today, to put it mildly. So coming up with some criteria there is going to be necessary. As far as the process, I do think we need to figure that out. Looking back past several releases, they've had between 30 and 50 enhancements filed through the features repo for each release. That is pretty significant. I wasn't envisioning SIG architecture explicitly sign off on every single KEP, but there probably needs to be an evaluation of whether SIG architecture needs to provide input to a KEP or not. And I think, you know, having the SIGs responsible for docs or release or testing can also be gatekeepers, and even instrumentation maybe, can also be gatekeepers of their relevant parts. SIG architecture doesn't have to be the only group. SIG architecture's responsibilities would be more around things like API changes, backward compatibility, and things like that, consistency of experience, and not necessarily all the criteria of and requirements we have of features going into Kubernetes.
So, Jago, I think you're next, and then Caleb, then Stephen.
Yeah, I wanted to add the point about monitoring, and I think just having a line in a template is enough to drive the conversation and shift the burden to the developer of the KEP, which is a useful mechanism in lots of ways. Active omission is itself data. But then also wanted to did we bottom out on KEPs replace features? And if so, my suggestion is that we more broadly communicate that, because I know that question has come around several times. I think we're there, so I would suggest we broadly communicate that.
Yeah, we need to broadly communicate.
Let's posit that I am strongly suggesting that we do that. I know that Caleb has been heavily involved in the creation of a command line tool for KEPs, and it sounds like it's going to be a bumpy experience. And he has personally expressed to me that he's not sure we are ready for this. But I really need some validation of a few things at a minimum, and I'm willing to endure a bumpy process to get us there. But I would like to get consensus from this group.
Yeah, I would also just like to end of life the existing design proposal process. There's still a bunch of design proposals open in the community repo, and that's just super problematic for trying to track what's going on.
Caleb?
So I'm hearing like a couple things. To your concerns specifically, Aaron, I share them in terms of trying to understand the quality and what to do when things go wrong, inevitably with enhancements that are coming for the release that you are the lead of, for 114. I think that the prior art of Dan and I requiring more or less what we internally at Google have, a launch checklist. We did this for 1.6. They were just Google Docs, and we worked directly with each of the enhancement owners to require them to produce this document so that we had enough confidence that the things were going to be okay, or when they stopped being okay, that we could roll things back if we needed to. I think that has been fine for the duration of a single release. In terms of using KEPs as that mechanism, I do not believe that either our ability to review them currently, because of the looseness of the format of KEPs, because there's no tooling that enforces what you must have there, is just not going to be possible. Certainly, I have no additional bandwidth as, when I'm not in meetings, I'm writing code that's not just for the CLI, but also what is the KEP itself. So you can actually, lint and block merges of KEPs which do not conform to the standards we agreed on here. And so that's just not going to be ready in time for 114. I wish I could say something different, but that's my best estimate as to when that will be ready. It's just not for 114. That being said, if you want to try, I can't obviously stop you from making that requirement. I have no confidence that that's going to go well enough to provide you the confidence you're looking for. So I just don't think KEPs are the mechanism you want for your particular release. For 115, I would really hope so. I would love to see us using KEPs to start that SIG architecture review if we need to in the 115 timeframe. And that's, I guess, my readout in terms of where we are today with KEPs.
Okay, so Patrick Lang next, and then Aaron.
Okay, so I just had a small question. Well, not really a question, but a point here. Like we call that monitoring. I think rather than saying monitoring, I think it would be reasonable to ask people to fill out a section to say, you know, what does your day two operations look like? But I think that that's something that not every KEP is going to need, and I think it's something that's going to go just going to be a little bit different to deployment. So I mean, I think it'd be good to have that as like a list of recommended sections, but like look later on the agenda, there's a question around, you know, what is the scope of Kubernetes? And on the one hand, monitoring is largely a decision around picking what you're going to use that's outside of the Kubernetes project today. And so I don't think we can make it something that's necessarily required, but I think it's reasonable for people to give some suggestions on what could be possible there. So that's all I had on that.
All right.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about scope, but specifically for monitoring, we do have a standard within the project that we export, of how we export data. I agree that aggregation and use of that data is outside the project, but in terms of making the data available, we do have standards within the project about that.
Okay, so Stephen, Aaron, Solly. Oh, you're good, Brian. Brian said it. Oh,
Hey,
okay.
so there was a question asked about like who the approvers of KEPs should be. So we have this delineation between KEPs that are SIG focused and KEPs that are Kubernetes wide. I think for KEPs that are Kubernetes wide, they should have SIG architecture oversight. I think that it's not exactly feasible to expect SIG architecture to be able to review every KEP. And SIG leads and chairs should take that on themselves to review KEPs that are specifically only SIG focused. Cross SIG efforts should have some idea of SIG architecture oversight though. So, there was another question. Right. So yeah. So I brought this up in the SIG architecture BOF for KubeCon, but there were mentions of the graduation criteria within KEPs. I think one of the problems that we have is that we don't have a global idea or a global standard for graduation criteria. And we never really got to discuss that in that BOF. So I think until we have that, we're going to keep bumping into the problem of what does a KEP look like? What does an enhancement look like when it's graduated?
Yeah, I put a link to the guidelines, the existing guidelines for what constitutes alpha, beta, or stable. That's current guidelines are API centric, and they need to be fleshed out with respect to additional criteria, such as test coverage, for example.
Yeah. So just a note that I a little bit disagree with the fact that monitoring needs to be included. I think that would be KEP dependent, like depending on what KEP it is, will determine whether or not we need to talk about monitoring. Like the KEPs for SIG PM or KEPs for architecture that come out may not need that. So TBD, right?
Aaron, and then Jacob.
Okay, so yes, the requirements thing is where I feel the full responsibility of SIG architecture lies. I just feel like this is the group that best makes sense to own defining the standard of criteria for alpha, beta, and stable. I'm not saying they should be the sole evaluators of criteria. So when I talk about upgrade, downgrade, I would expect cluster lifecycle to probably be best qualified to vet that. And I would expect docs to be best qualified to put in some items about whether or not docs have been done. But I just, like, again, it comes back to the release team doesn't really have time to do a thorough deep dive. We need to be able to delegate out this deep dive stuff so that all we're really doing is verifying whether or not the checkboxes have been checked. So I do think it's important that SIG architecture is involved with most every KEP to ensure that the, not to jump ahead, but like the scope of Kubernetes is preserved and that there is at least some amount of oversight on even single SIG-centric KEPs, just to make sure that for example, when we all say we're agreeing upon something, there is somebody who's actually enforcing that that's happening. And then finally, to Caleb's point about the feasibility of doing this with automation or not, I hear that, which is why I'm sitting here asking for help or suggestions on the best path to proceed. I feel like using KEPs and making sure that test plan and upgrade downgrade plans are in the KEP is something that we as humans can review. And no, we're not going to be able to like automatically block merges and stuff. But I'm wondering if it simplifies and federates work a little bit more for us than having to use a tracking spreadsheet.
I guess, sorry, not to jump in. Sorry to jump. Yeah, sorry.
Go for it, Caleb.
Well, not suggesting a tracking spreadsheet specifically. And you may want to follow up with Daniel and the API machinery team. But like literally, we gave them a questionnaire of you must tell us these 5 things or your feature will not ship in the release. One of them was, how do we roll this back? Another one was, what is the scope? Another one was, how do we know this works? I could try and dig this up, but we put the onus on the people who are trying to deliver an enhancement. This was, years before KEPs, years before we had even a second iteration on the features tracking repository. So there is prior art that will allow you, I believe, to get the questions you want and you need answered as the release team answered. And that can be an issue that's just separated out from everything else here.
So I agree, those are the questions I want answered. It's going to make me very sad if it means that a bunch of humans are individually scheduling some one-on-one meetings and sending documents around. It made sense to me that that's the sort of information that sounds appropriate for a KEP. And so I was trying to kind of move us towards one central source of truth for this stuff. Okay, I'm talking out of turn again, so sorry.
I don't see any other hands raised, but I have a point. So KEPs are becoming critical path for the success of this project because it's the aggregate place where we talk about, so it's basically a many views of one piece of data thing that we're trying to preserve here. And as many things are in architecture, it seems like we have a lack of commitment in terms of people working on this. Caleb has invested a lot of engineering hours in a tool that's written in Go that's extremely well documented and has basically a CLI that can be applied to it right now. How do we mobilize people around, one, the social effort of getting people to buy into the KEPs as a whole, because that's not there. Two, how do we get the automation and the implementation of Caleb's tooling so it's not just Caleb working on this solo? And then 3, how do we actually see this through to completion in a reasonable time? Because right now we have no commitments on any of that. This is all just unfunded work sitting out there, but it's critical path. So how do we move forward here?
I think one way to move forward is to make that a gating factor to move to the next level. So making it a requirement to have a KEP for every feature is step 1. Those graduation criteria from one phase to another, getting increasingly detailed is another. And the tool makes it possible. I didn't come up with this, but someone mentioned that like a KEP linter is possible if it is structured data. And I think maybe we have a few categories of KEPs and a few categories of templates. But when driving culture change to implement things like consistent behavior across multiple components and features, knowing how that it's working in production is something that's useful to be consistent across all of these components. And so putting it into a KEP, like the consistency of downgrade behavior and ability to do so is useful to be consistent across multiple SIGs. And so that's where I think this group comes into play, and that making it a gating factor inspires those who work with it to get frustrated and fix things that don't work and add features to make it less friction.
Yeah, I think in terms of driving it forward is actually not that hard. Like the KEP process is no worse than the ad hoc design proposal process, and quite a few people followed that in the past. So if we just socialize it amongst the gatekeepers and the people who see things fly by, like SIG release and the release team, SIG testing, contributor experience, this group, I think that will take us a long way in terms of making sure that we get people into the funnel. And we can also communicate through the other forms: community meeting, Kubernetes dev, mailing list, etc.
I'm just more concerned that I could sign up to jump on that grenade, and I'm willing to do that, but at some point we need to spread the work out. And it doesn't necessarily have to be people in this room. It can be anybody on this call, or anybody even as a SIG lead, or anybody, but we have to get more people actually doing the work.
Yeah, SIG leads are another group of people we should socialize this with.
Yeah, for sure. And then the coding aspects of Caleb's tool, if that's going to become the de facto standard how we manage these things, that's an engineering effort. We need to have engineering rigor around that. And yeah, it works. I demoed the tool at KubeCon. It's a fantastic tool, even in its early stages. So I would love to see somebody volunteer to help Caleb move this forward.
You could post that to the board.
So I've spoken with Caleb, and I actually have volunteered for some of this, but we do need even more people than just Caleb and myself.
I review a lot of KEPs, so I would be happy to take a look. Somebody may give me a demo and figure out where we want to go with it.
Yep.
I'm happy to sign up.
Cool.
I'm happy to.
Cool.
Sorry, who is that?
That's Tim. I'll actually come into the office next week.
Cool. So Aaron, you had your hand up, and then Jordan.
I feel like another thing this group has often talked about is needing to review the existing backlog of KEPs. And so it felt to me like this overlapped with that goal by prioritizing everything that was going to land in 114. I agree with Jago when I think when I'm using the terminology of land, I am talking about explicitly showing up in one of the three phases. You could also argue that if we want to draw a hard line, that when we talk about we really need to stabilize everything, that we say we are not accepting anything that's attempting to land as alpha, that we're only accepting things that are attempting to promote to beta or promote to stable. Just some thoughts, but I still, I unfortunately didn't come prepared with the concrete task of okay, here's the list and I need names assigned to all these things, but I want us to get to that point. And I'm not sure I really see people jumping up and down to volunteer despite the litany of nodding heads that I have seen.
So I do plan on, I kind of got caught up this week, but I'm trying to spend and work through all of them. Now, I'm not exactly sure which ones are scoped to go into which releases. I'll have to go through again. I don't know if we capture that detail to be able to help you with 114.
We do.
We do have it.
It's a milestone within the enhancements repo.
I'll have to go take a look at it. It wasn't there before in the old community repo, was it? Or was I missing it?
No, that was only the features repo. So now that it's the
Okay,
enhancements repo, it still has a milestone.
Okay, that's good. Then I'll prioritize based on the 114 ones because I have been going in and reviewing them myself. That's actually how I got suckered into the SIG architecture things.
I'm not
looking for heroes here. I'm looking for a concerted effort by a group of people where we can actually shard out and federate the work. So
just a note that so Claire Lawrence is the enhancements lead for the 114 release team. So she should be delegating that work. So just hold off until we get the release spun up.
Yeah. She just got back from vacation today, and we're going to regroup tomorrow based on the outcomes of this conversation and any follow-ups that we have. Because again, this is about sort of scoping and trying to figure out what's feasible. I do want to be realistic, but I just feel like I saw so much vigorous head nodding that we really do need to actually do something, or it's just continued words.
Yeah, Jordan has had his hand up.
Yep.
I was just going to say that as we identify pieces of information we need to inform the release team and others and update the KEP template, a good step to do along with that would be to go update all the existing KEPs that are missing that information and just add those questions with TBD, or something to make sure we're getting that information. Presumably we're asking those questions because they're important and we need to know that information. And so making sure that the things already in progress have an opportunity to provide that information as well. So let's not forget to do that.
Yeah, I just, until there is like automation for this, that alone would take probably someone one whole day. That's kind of what I'm saying. It's like, if we are trying to use the KEP process as a tool to like improve the quality, we actually have to be ready to roll it out with, like I said, like it's software like everything else. Like there needs to be a rollout plan. We need like training materials. That all this is not going to work just by like, you know, saying there's a tool here or there's a process and you must follow it. Like we need
I agree. But if the alternative is let the things that are currently in process continue without considering these things or asking those questions, I would take a copy and paste the 3 new things we decided questions that need to be added to the template, copy and paste that, and like put them into every existing KEP and ping the owner. Like I would take that over wait 6 months until we have tooling and let these things continue on unconsidered. So, but yeah. I agree that we need tooling, and once we have it, it will be better.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm trying to push us to triage something for 114, solve that problem because it's a current problem we have, and then use our learnings there to improve things radically as we move forward.
Okay, so we're about out of time for this topic. I do want to leave adequate time for the scope topic. I was planning to take a stab at the maturity criteria. I will try to do that in the near future. I ended up getting sidetracked by the scope topic first. So let's move on to that. So in terms of follow-up action items, do we have a volunteer from someone to update the template, or do we want to come up with the criteria first and then update the template?
So I've already got that in my court. So I've linked the project tracking board that has a bunch of stuff around what we've discussed already. So everyone check that out when you get a chance. It's in the agenda. But yeah, I will be taking on the updates to the template.
Yeah, so I'd like to be involved in that discussion, and I want to make sure I'm involved in the checklist, and I'd like to see where we are on that checklist by next week.
And quickly, did we come to any consensus about what the state of the KEP needs to be? Is it simply that it's there and merged, or does it need any SIG oversight before it's?
I think if it's going in for a plan for a release, then it should be implementable.
So it's sort of a forcing function. So we can just say it's implementable if it's going to release ergo.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So I will work on piecing together a list of mapping of features to KEPs and see where we're missing them and what their state is.
Great. Thanks, everybody. This is a really great discussion, and I'm glad that we're really tackling this. So, next topic.
Now that we got the easy one out of the way.
Yeah. So scope. Matt, you have your name on this, but I think it's a kind of a group discussion about this.
It is. So I put it up here, but it kind of plays into the conversations we've been having into the last year or so, many of which are not documented. And that is, what is the scope of Kubernetes now, right? Not what did we do before, but in the last year, just to give everyone on the same page with background, we started to say no to a lot of features and to say those are in the ecosystem. And then we worked on extensibility, pluggability, and things like that. Like, not every new cloud provider comes in. We're actually moving the existing ones out, but we're giving a mechanism for many cloud providers to be in the loop. There were lots of features that we said, no, we're not going to do that here. It's better to do that with CRDs, CRs, and operators of your own than add something new. We've been focusing a lot on that and on our own in-house quality. So the question now becomes, and we haven't documented this, but we've talked about it, where does Kubernetes end? And I think that's important because the ecosystem needs to know, where do they begin? Where does that interface happen? And there will be some overlap, but where is that space? And what's going on here? Does that make sense? That's kind of the question that's out there, and we haven't documented it. I've come to realize that not everybody's on the same page with this, either whether it's communicated out to many of the people working on things, or we're even not always in agreement on what this should be. Tim, you said it's documented somewhere? Where? Do you know?
Brian's old document that he created with the layered architectural diagram pretty much is a synopsis of where the boundary lines kind of occur. And there was part of a doc and a diagram that existed a while ago.
Yeah, I just dropped links to several documents actually into the agenda notes document. I do have plans to update the document you're referring to. There is a link, that's one of the documents. There's a link to, and we have the original description, what is Kubernetes and what is not Kubernetes on kubernetes.io, which I did update a year ago, and the corresponding KubeCon talk, which included the layers. There's the architecture roadmap doc that includes the layers. There's additionally an architecture doc, a principles doc, and a resource management document that talks in more detail about the API server and the API machinery and the resource management parts of the system specifically. And then there were some recent discussions that had some additional, I think, good points that were raised. For example, the Helm proposal, CNCF Helm proposal that Matt participated on surfaced some good issues. So I actually went last night and yesterday afternoon and collected a bunch of those. So I'm gonna edit that a little bit and send it out after this meeting. For a long time, we've had this discussion about what is core, and different people mean different things by that, and I think that's relevant because we have a bunch of different scopes. I mean, there's the project as a whole and all of its GitHub organizations. You know, there are specific repositories like Kubernetes. There's things like the staging directory. So it's getting more complicated over time when people say, what does it mean to be in Kubernetes? Is it in the release? Is it in the original main repository, et cetera? So there will be some nuance there, but I did actually go through a list and try to update the list from the architectural roadmap document in terms of the functionality that we believe is in scope. And I think we'll need some high-level guidance as well as some lower-level details about what does containerized workload execution management mean? What does service discovery, load balancing, and routing entail? What is included in the declarative resource management platform? I did find that there are more than a dozen other considerations other than purely technical scope, which have influenced decisions in the past, and I think makes sense to influence decisions in the future as well. So it's not going to be like a completely cut and dry rubric, I believe.
Mm-hmm. So there were two angles that I wanted to also say need to be involved in this. When we talk about Kubernetes, there's kind of Kubernetes at two levels. There's Kubernetes, the thing that we ship on that release cycle, but then the Kubernetes project has a number of other things, whether it's Minikube, kube control, which has the goal of actually breaking out and having its own release schedule. There are other things within the umbrella. And so when we look at this, we probably need to address both of them, right? Both what is in the Kubernetes org, unless something within that org is deemed to be ecosystem but grandfathered in, and I'll use Compose with a K as an example of that. And then there are things, that are more core, like what falls under the project versus what is Kubernetes. There's a difference there, right? And we probably need to acknowledge that and look at those things and say, this is in the Kubernetes project, but it is ecosystem like everything else, versus things that we say are, well, this is part of the core of Kubernetes, because we have a little bit of both cases. And do we say, well, things like Compose with a K are grandfathered in and we don't want new things like that in the project, or are new things like that okay? And that's kind of important for SIGs. When SIGs say, okay, we want to go work on something and it's not part of core, but we'll do it in Kubernetes SIG and it's a new CLI. Should that actually be said, no, that needs to be out in the ecosystem, or is that okay? And then how do we position that scope-wise to say, is it official, is it not official? And I say that because somebody actually came to me middle of last year and said, hey, can we get this thing into Kubernetes somewhere so we can say it's the go-to way to do it? And they actually wanted to have their thing and position it against their competitors by saying it's in Kubernetes 6, right? And so when we talk about scope, there's core Kubernetes, and then there's all these other things we work on and put in there, right? Okay, I'll actually relinquish at that because.
One I want to add, I think this is getting more challenging over time. One I'll add is core DNS being the default DNS that is own org and repo and project. So I think it's not limited to those things that are core and those things that happen to be in the org that are grandfathered in. As the Kubernetes project gets broken into more and smaller components, we move to a more complex world. So I think there's parts to it than even
so I think we're rehashing history. I mean, we've had these conversations in steering and in Arch. I know that Brian, myself, Tim Hawkins, Joe Beta have all had these conversations a number of times. I think what we've lacked to do is to enforce some of the things that we've wanted to do over time. The carrot and stick philosophy has not applied, especially the stick. Like, what does it mean to restructure these projects so that they actually live in something that's understandable to external people? That has not occurred. So we have this legacy or history, but we have conversed about it. We have documents, but it's not as cohesive. So there's a running history of knowledge that exists that's partially written down. And I do think it's probably worth someone's effort to, formalize it a little better. But we've had a problem with enforcement from a steering perspective. We've never wanted to push these things into specific locations.
Yeah, Caleb?
Yeah, I guess to touch on one point you made, Matt, I do think that it's, I also share the concern about people trying to get things into Kubernetes just to talk about it. I have been happy to see what's been going on with the cloud providers. I think DigitalOcean coming in, I guess really Andrew coming in as a representative for DigitalOcean and taking on a bunch of project work in order to build that kind of trust to get code in is really helpful. I don't know more generally, but I do think that, if as a general line, that if you want to get something in, you better have done some sustaining work in the project that doesn't already exist today.
Matt?
Okay, a couple of things. First, when it comes to you have to have done sustaining work, that actually kind of prioritizes people who've been around and letting them get their pet features in rather than saying a scope line, right? Even if I've been around for a long time, if something should be squarely in the ecosystem, it shouldn't be based on people. It should be based on the scope of things. And then you can say, okay, I may have contributed a bunch of things to Kubernetes in here, but this particular thing I want to do should be in the ecosystem. So I need to go find the right place to do it there. I would like something that's maybe a page-long document that says, this is generally what's in, this is what should go in the ecosystem. So we've got kind of clear, concise guidance. And then when people are reviewing KEPs, right, they can use that to say, based on this document over here, and you can go read it, this is what's in, this is what's out. So that thing should probably go live in the ecosystem. And then we can encourage them in the right place to do it there. I have another thing, but it looks like Aaron wants to respond to what I had to say.
Well, I want to say one thing about that. I don't know if I agree in general that it biases towards people who are already in the project. I think the specific case of Andrew, who showed up, suggests that we can, as us here in this room and in the SIG, can help guide new people to making those sustaining contributions. We can be the change we want to see.
Brian?
I don't know, was Aaron had something to say?
Okay. So, yeah, I agree with Tim. I think we're rehashing history here. I'm not really a big fan of pontificating and thinking about the abstract what ifs. I'm a much bigger fan of us operating in an iterative manner as a project. So I'm actually, big picture, I'm curious why this is so important. If there are any massive choices that can't be undone. Helm, as an example, like came into the project and then also left the project, right? So hang on, there's that. Number two, if we all have in our heads this idea that Kubernetes is a project committed to extensibility as priority number one above reliability and quality and support, then I again think that SIG architecture should be the group of people who evaluate every potential change to the project with this rubric in mind, right? Like for a given KEP, is it actually doing something that's putting extensibility first, or does it need to be redone so as to align with this priority? Because again, to Tim's point, I think we've said it, I'm not sure we enforce it. Okay.
Clayton, then Matt.
Yeah, I agree with Aaron. I prefer getting much more concrete. Like this was triggered by customize. There was extensive discussion in the SIG, but it didn't. I think there was a feeling that this didn't get a meta discussion outside of the SIG. And now we're coming back afterwards and raising the larger meta. I'd be happier about being more concrete in this case and trying to narrow down to whether customize is out, and then using this as an opportunity to go clarify some of our in-out criteria, which feels much more like a smaller group or a smaller set of discussion rather than like the larger meta discussion. I got to be honest, like I don't feel like we've done a terrible job of scope. There have always been small edge cases. It's getting harder now, but it certainly doesn't seem like we're broken.
Yeah. So what I'm asking actually for is the documented subset. So that way we're all on the same page. When we don't document it, it gives it open to some wiggle room in that. We don't have a place to point people to either. I mean, more than once I've had to go say, well, we discussed it over here. And do you want to go into the meeting minutes? I mean, to actually documenting our general policy and scope, I'm happy to take a first pass at that and get others to review it, but actually just to have it in writing so we can share it with people and tell people it shouldn't be a bad idea if we want these things in writing. But then to narrow it down to something like customize, which what spurred this on. And it was actually somebody, I mean, I'm the one who fired off the first email, but it was somebody came to me and pointed out what somebody else was saying about it, because I was the third person in that particular chain. And the question there became, what belongs in the ecosystem versus not? What side of the API do we live on, and how does that work? Because okay, no, Aaron, but why? Is Kubernetes going to compete with the ecosystem? Because one of the things that people feel, and this is a little bit feeling, is if it's in core, it is the way, and people will say, but that's in core, it's the way, and therefore don't do it another way. And so once we get outside of the Kubernetes API into workflows outside of it, so we create something, we declare to the API, what do we want? And then the API, Kubernetes goes and makes it so, but those workflows outside of it, right? People have a lot of opinions on how those should be. In SIG apps, we've had, I want to say it's over 100 demos of tools that talk to the APIs. And many of them have come up with different workflows for their business. It's where apps interact with the API to do management things. There's a lot of things out there doing a lot of stuff. And if Kubernetes is going to go start having opinions out there as a project, people are going to, what was the way it's described to me? The common denominator, the lowest common denominator starts to move, and that impacts these ecosystem projects, these other projects, these other folks' workflow. And so should that kind of work then live as an ecosystem thing alongside the other ecosystem projects, so it's fair game and it's not essentially broadcasting to others that, hey, we're moving the lowest common denominator on you and this is how you should be? Because people do interpret it that way. Where is our interface to that ecosystem?
So Phil or Jago, you can wrestle it out with you first.
I just want to call quick attention to the arbitrary line of time and just order of execution. I think that many of these same arguments could have applied to deployment or daemon set or any of the core workloads controllers. And solely because of the people who arrived and the time that they arrived, it went into core, and it is the way it's done. And those are standard across Kubernetes installations. And I think there's value to that consistency across installations. So simply because the Kubernetes community didn't get to something in that order, I don't think that there should be a blanket statement. Whatever exists today is all that will ever exist, and we will work aggressively to move things out of core. I think there's also movement in both directions. There's cloud providers are moving out of core for good reasons. There may be good reasons to move something into core. So I just want to call out that we are at a point in time that is somewhat arbitrary to have this conversation just because it's coming up. Yeah, sorry, Phil, go.
Yeah, sure. I think I just had a couple questions. Like, one is who decides if something is competing with the ecosystem? Like, does the ecosystem get to decide that Kubernetes is competing with them? And the other was, like, is the ecosystem free to compete with Kubernetes, right? And the ecosystem starts to build something that they determine as competes with Kubernetes. Are we okay with that, or do we need to, like, react to it? Besides that.
That should probably be a topic for future discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, so when it comes to, first I want to address the workloads API, right? Because I think that actually gets into how things have changed over time with Kubernetes. The scope that we had and the way we reacted to things a year and a half or 2 years ago is different than today. And I know because there was talk of adding another object to the workloads API around application, and that was deemed that, okay, we actually need to do that separate. Maybe it gets in. And the reason it's even a SIG thing is because we're only touching the scope that has to do with interoperability between other projects. And so rather than it being in a new thing, workload controllers coming in, we actually say now those go into the ecosystem because our scope has changed, right? That's kind of how we do it. We don't say we've always done it this way. We actually say at one point, well, we're going to stop doing the new features in, and we're going to be more about interoperability, and we're going to ask those new kinds of things to go into the ecosystem. And then if something really hits home, 90-some% of people, lots of people are using it, then we'll look at whether it should be in the core of Kubernetes and evaluate it, but really we want it in the ecosystem. This was kind of the guidance that we had a while ago. And so when I look at it this way, and then I look at the ecosystem and I say, well, where do we define this line? Like if it were me to define the line, I would say, okay, new workloads controllers, things like that, go in the ecosystem unless there is something that needs to happen for interoperability. And the same thing if you're going to interact with the Kubernetes API. New things that are going to interact with the Kubernetes API or new things that deal with your workflows outside of the Kubernetes API, those are ecosystem, but the existing things we leave where they are. That's where I would probably draw that line because that makes a clear point to the ecosystem that says, you want to add new tooling on how I work with things outside of the API, that's just ecosystem, right? New things that do that is all ecosystem. New controllers in Kubernetes, unless there is a darn good reason and exception, those are all ecosystem. And then in your cap for all this, you've got to justify that exception and the reason it has to be there. That's where I would draw the line. And then that lets us focus on what Kubernetes is, breaking things apart, focusing on the quality and other things without trying to do that. All right.
So we have almost no time. Tim, Aaron, and Jordan are last, and then we're going to call us.
Jordan gets the final word. Just to layer on what Jago said, I agree completely. I don't think that the fact that we have built-in deployments has ever inhibited anybody from building their own workload controllers if it made sense. That's fine. I don't think we have an obligation as a project to be completely neutral territory. I think we in fact have the opposite obligation to find and choose the best breed of solutions for customers who are using Kubernetes, and to not do that I think would be a failing of leadership on the project. I'm not saying anything about customized because I don't hold an opinion on it, but I'm saying as project leaders, we are obligated to look around the ecosystem and look at the things that are the best ideas that are working best for people and bring those things in and give them best support. Lastly, Kubernetes is really at least two projects at this point. There's all the API machinery and the tools that use to host and run APIs and the tools used to access APIs. And there's the Kubernetes sort of application that builds on top of all of that. And I think the same argument holds for both. I think this sort of emergent distinction, we never planned for that, right? But this emergent distinction shifts a little bit of the thinking of where the boundaries might have been in the past, because we have a more generic core of API and machinery that maybe would take on things that we wouldn't have thought about early on because it's trying to be serving a more general role. And I'll cede the floor to that.
Hey, Jordan, last word.
I just wanted to kind of call out the different dimensions of changes that are made. So on the one hand, you have things that are pretty clear, like cloud providers, where the entire purpose of these is to adapt Kubernetes to a particular vendor or a particular environment. And so making those be extension points and be done out of core makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, you have, like Matt was describing, ways that you interact with the API, things that are very basic to do, things that are generic and aren't focused at a particular vendor or particular integration, like applying labels consistently across a bunch of objects, or taking an API object and applying an API patch to it. Like, these are not targeted at a specific vendor or specific environment. They are API-driven interactions. And to look at some of those things that need to be done and say, well, the experience around these is bad with the tools that Kubernetes provides. But then to say, well, but we're not going to actually improve that. We're going to let the ecosystem improve that. I think that misaligns incentives. That aligns the ecosystem to solving pain points in Kubernetes rather than as add-ons and extensions, rather than working to improve those aspects of the tooling that is part of the Kubernetes project. So I think characterizing attempts to address usability issues with the existing Kubernetes tool chain as competing with the ecosystem, that doesn't make sense to me.
One of the problems we have with this, though, is we don't have anybody with usability and user experience work doing these evaluations. It's a lot of our opinions who come here, right? And quite frankly, my opinion versus yours is 2 people out of tens of thousands of people who use it and looking at it. Sorry, I know, last word. But even when we think about our workflows, one of the things that I realized was we think about our workflows through CI/CD to do things and then editing objects outside of it. That's just one workflow, right? An app person might build an app to deploy WordPress sites into a Kubernetes cluster, and their app talks to the API with no CI/CD in the loop. We need to start thinking outside of the DevOps world that some of us live in into other ways and all of this happens. And when we think about the workflows that we do and the experience we do, we're not thinking about many of the possibilities that are out there because they're not core to us. And when we do things around the way we do some of it, how does that hinder or help some of those things? And I just don't think those conversations come up because we don't have a focus on UX or even a good handle on a lot of those API end users.
Great. As ex-chair of SIG Cluster Ops, which was ostensibly for that exact purpose, it died of attrition. So when people come, we'll listen, but so far we haven't had any luck. So thank you, everybody. See you in a week.
I do have one real quick concrete plug, so I too get the last word. I think to talk to the specific concerns around customize and other CLIs that want to see kubectl plugins be the one true path. I thought there was a great demo of Crew, a community project to bundle up a set of kubectl plugins to make it much easier to have like a canonical distro path. I would encourage folks to work on that. And I think that the plugin mechanism itself still needs some work to properly meet the needs of sundry ecosystem projects. And I would argue that it is more constructive to show up and help out with that plugin mechanism rather than to stand back and say that it's not good enough. Because I think that aligns incentives to make the community experience and ecosystem experience a lot better and does actually enforce in code our desire to make extensions and plugins the true path forward. So SIG CLI would be a fantastic place to have those discussions, and I look forward to seeing the ecosystem show up there. It's usually a pretty open agenda. There's lots of time. So yeah.
I'd also just plug more generally that SIG CLI could use some help chopping wood and carrying water. So it doesn't have nearly as many contributors as it used to.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Happy Thursday.